Everyone, my name is Maureen Scallon-Fahler, and I am president of the Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce. The Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce is the influential regional voice that champions promotion and improvement of the business environment, cultivating vibrant regional and local communities. I would like to acknowledge all the organizations that made this event happen today. Our host, Dakota County Technical College and Ember Hills Community College. Our sponsors, Ember Hills Community Foundation, Home Federal Bank, Velocity Public Affairs. Let's give them all a round of applause. I also want to give special acknowledgement to our area chamber partners that are here today that really help support this event. The Apple Valley and Burnsville Chamber of Commerce. Ed Kearney and Jennifer, could you please stand? Thank you. We deeply appreciate the relationship that we have with all the area chambers of commerce in Dakota County because we are better together. Thank you. We are streaming this event live for those who cannot attend. Please feel free to tweet. Our hashtag is MN02. MN02. As citizens and businesses and residents, we have the right to cast our vote for individuals that represent our interests. These leaders you elect make the decisions that affect you, your business, your job, health care, taxes, economic security, and our future workforce, and much, much more. Today's candidate forum is one opportunity to educate and engage the voters from Congressional District 2. And we are honored to have our two candidates here with us this morning, Congressman Jason Lewis and challenger Angie Craig. We appreciate your participation as this is a very, very important discussion that we are having here this morning. Dakota County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state of Minnesota, and it is so important that our communities in CD2 continue to have the success of economic growth, educational opportunities, overall health, and vibrancy. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some of the rules and the conduct of code that we will have for today. A coin toss was determined, and Congressman Lewis will go first. Each candidate will be given 3 minutes for opening comments. We will then go into questions, and then each candidate will have up to 2 minutes to respond to each question. Josie, where's Josie Newby? Josie, thank you so much. Josie is our timekeeper, and she is president of the Student Senate at Ember Hills Community College. Who knows, someday you might be up here, Josie. She will hold a yellow card at the halfway point, and then she will hold a red stop card when your time is up. This is intended as a tool to monitor the length of comments and responses so we can keep the conversation moving throughout the program. The order of candidates to answer the questions will alternate with each new question asked. Finally, each candidate will have 1 minute to provide a closing statement. I will now review the conduct of code for our audience. We ask that you do not hold up signs or any physical displays while in the room. Refrain from applauding or any other ways demonstrating support or non-support for a candidate. Please silence all cell phones. There will be no taping of the debate from the audience members. Please note that we are streaming this event and we will have it available afterwards online as well for people to view. All questions have been prepared and vetted prior to the forum. Written questions were submitted in advance by the general public, chamber members, business in general, and the Student Senate of DCTC and Ember Hills Community College. Venue and security will be policing on the site. Security and our ushers will be stationed throughout the venue. If you cannot comply, we might have to ask you to leave. If you do leave during the forum and you have to leave, you will not be able to enter back in. We do have overflow rooms. If need be, you can go back up to one of the overflow rooms. We will now start with opening comments, and we will start with Congressman Lewis.
Maureen, thank you so much. I appreciate your attendance here and organizing this. Thanks to the Dakota County Chamber for getting behind this debate, very crucial to the 2nd District. Thank you to Dakota County Tech. It's great to be back here. We've been here many, many times over the last couple of years, and they're doing a great job on preparing students for the 21st century. Thanks to Angie Craig for participating in this debate, and all of you out there, thank you for your civic duty and attending and what you do. Let me just start with some of the news of the day. Given the events of yesterday and the incivility that seems ubiquitous these days everywhere, let us all try to commit ourselves to acting as though we can have a civil debate, that we can have a vigorous debate, which I'm sure Angie and I will have, and then get up and shake hands and go our separate ways and do our civic duty. We have got to restore, and this didn't start yesterday. It started 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It started a long time ago, where people get so wound up in their cause that sometimes they lose the best of themselves. Going on to having a good, vigorous debate and then behaving like we all know we should. One thing we can all agree on, though, and that is economic growth, and that's where I want to start. When I ran in 2016, I ran on a flatter, fairer tax code to jumpstart an economy that was growing at about 1.9% for a decade. And quite frankly, in both administrations, both the Bush and Obama administrations, we saw anemic growth. We flattened that tax code. We had the greatest tax overhaul in, indeed, 3 decades. A 20% cut for pass-through businesses, 90% of filers got a cut. We finally got the highest industrialized corporate tax cut in the world down to be competitive. And what have we seen along with some regulatory reform? We've seen economic growth not at 3%, not at 3.5%, at 4.5%. We've got after-tax income growing at 6%, 7 million job openings last month. We've got more job openings than job seekers. We doubled the child care credit, doubled the standard deduction, expanded 529 plans, a family credit for business so they can give folks time off. This has been a great success story. And the reason I bring it up first is everything we want to do and everything you want from St. Paul or Washington is not possible without economic growth. If you can't, we can't support Social Security and Medicare. We can't support the Defense Department. We can't support education without growth. A 1% increase in economic growth over 10 years elicits $3 trillion more in federal revenue. So we can go from 1.9% growth to 4% growth. We're going to see payroll taxes actually go up to fund Medicare and Social Security. And in fact, payroll taxes are up $105 billion this year from last year. Individual tax receipts, individual income tax receipts are up this year at lower rates than last year at higher rates. This is something that happened in the 1920s. This is something that John Kennedy understood when he went to the Economic Club of New York and advocated tax cuts from the top all the way down. And this is something Reagan understood and we understood, and that's why we did it, and that's why we're seeing growth, and that is a prerequisite to everything we want to do.
Go ahead, Angie.
Well, my name is Angie Craig, and it's an honor and a privilege to run for Congress here in Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District. Maureen, I want to say thank you to the Chamber. It's such a pleasure to be here. And Michael, thank you to Dakota County Technical College for having us here today. I grew up in a mobile home court. My mom was a single mom. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through college. I worked my way up 2 different healthcare manufacturing companies. I ran HR and communications for those businesses. Today, I own part of a small business in St. Paul. I know how lucky I've been. For part of my own childhood, I grew up without health insurance. There's no one who understands better that if health care isn't affordable, it's not available. My wife Cheryl and I have 4 boys. 2 are in traditional 4-year universities. One's a sophomore at Rosemont High School, and one is pursuing an advanced manufacturing degree and becoming a CNC operator. My family, more than most, or as much as most, knows that there is not just one path. for all students. I believe we have to change the way that we are thinking in this country about career skills and technical education. I ran HR for a major Minnesota business. I know that not all jobs require a 4-year degree. As a member of Congress, I am going to fight to lower the cost of health care, especially the cost of prescription drugs. I'll work to promote a fresh approach to the economy and education, because there is not just one approach that we should take. I'll work to partner locally with our cities and our towns and our townships. I'll work to support our farmers. I'll listen more than I'll talk, and I'll listen to everyone. Finally, the way we do campaigns and politics in this country must change. We have to tackle campaign finance reform in this nation. And that is the dark, anonymous money that is flowing into campaigns from all sides. Until we do that, we are not going to have a Congress that will stand up to prescription drug companies and make them reform so that we can all afford today's health care. I'll never forget, as a member of Congress, who sent me there and who I work for. I will never forget where I came from, and at the end of the day, it would be an honor and a privilege to represent you as a member of Congress.
Thank you, Angie. We will now move into the questions. So we're going to start with education because we're here at DCTC. This country is currently facing a crisis of student loan debt while employers are unable to find workers with the skills and training that they need to grow their companies. How will you ensure that all post-secondary options are open to young people, both affordable traditional colleges and universities, and increased pathways to career and technical education? And we will start with the Congressman.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a proper question given where we are, right? I have been here many times because this is near and dear to my heart. My granddad was a machinist. My dad was a mechanical engineer. And my family made things. We were in the automotive aftermarket business. That's what people here get trained for in many cases. And that's why I was so proud to offer the dual enrollment amendment so that kids could take shop class here when they don't have it at high school. Career and technical is the workforce of the 21st century. We talk to employers every day in the 2nd District, and they say, I don't need more anthropology degrees. I need somebody that can operate a computerized lathe. I need somebody that can be a millwright, electrician, everything you're doing right here. So one of the ways to tackle the rising tuition, which is going up in post-secondary 4-year schools, 400%, faster than healthcare, faster than gasoline, faster than food, is to get competition. To get kids to go to a technical school for a year and say, you know what, I'm going to get a job out of here paying $70,000 a year with health care, with a $5,000 student loan that my new employer is going to pay off. That will force tuition to come down. The other thing we're trying to do with 4-year liberal arts degrees is make certain they have skin in the game. I offered a complete college success or successful completion of college amendment that would say they have skin in the game when they make a loan. So if they make a student loan to a young student and they drop out, and remember, about 55%, only 55% of kids going to a 4-year school complete in 6 years. Most of them don't complete in 6 years, let alone 4. If they drop out, they're stuck with the debt. Our thought was the institution should also be stuck with part of the debt so that they have a reason to make certain that person succeeds. All of those things we try to do in career and technical education, though, is the key, which is why we've been glad to lead on that. And I'm happy to say that our dual enrollment amendment, allowing kids to take a class at Dakota County Tech while they're in high school, was signed into law in the Perkins reauthorization bill, signed in the 115th, the largest CTE bill in a decade, and I was glad to lead the way on that.
Thank you. Angie Craig.
Well, we do have a crisis in this country around the cost of higher education, there's no doubt. 70% of Minnesota students have debt coming out of higher education. That's the 5th highest rate in the country, and the average student loan debt coming out of university is $31,000. I think we need to increase access to Pell Grants as a result of what's happening in this country. In addition, I worked for businesses for over 20 years. And it's unfathomable to me that the business that I worked for paid interest rates on our loans of about 2.3%, and young people in this country are paying 8 to 10%. It's just unbelievable. But as I said in my opening remarks, we have 4 boys. 2 are in college, traditional college, and 1 is in a trade program getting his advanced manufacturing degree. We have to go back to the basics as we think about jobs and the economy in this country. There are 143,000 open positions in Minnesota right now, and only 0.6 applicants for each of those. I don't believe it's enough to just politely encourage kids to look at the trades in high school. I think we have got to reintegrate career skills and vocational education back in our high schools. Josh is our oldest son. He's the one pursuing the advanced manufacturing degree. And he's the kid who took the truck apart in the driveway almost every day, whether he could get it put back together or not. And so I think we have got to understand that one-size-fits-all education model doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work for the economy that exists today. We've got to partner with private businesses and reintegrate the way we're thinking about education. You know, my opponent sitting here today actually voted to cut Pell Grants in a vote that he took as a member of Congress. That cut Pell Grants for 3,400 students in the 2nd Congressional District. It's not enough just to politely say we should do this. We need to prioritize education in this country again.
We will not have, I'm sorry, Jason, any rebuttal or comments, so we can keep the questions moving. Sorry about that, I misunderstood.
We redirected Pell Grants to CTE is what we did.
So we will now move on to another question, and we will start with Angie Craig. What is the greatest challenge facing public higher education?
Well, look, I think the greatest challenge facing public higher education in this country is how do we make sure that the skills that we are promoting in higher education are the ones that are actually going to get people a good job. Look, it's the 21st century now. America has a huge opportunity to lead in 21st century manufacturing, in the jobs of the future, in information technology, in technology jobs. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that the programs that exist are available and affordable to young people. It comes back to this challenge of it shouldn't matter how much money you're born into. If you are willing to work hard, then you should be able to access higher education in this country. And I think that's something we have to rethink, even in higher education. What programs are we running, and what's the placement rate for these students when they get out of college? Again, $31,000 is the average student loan debt when an individual gets out. And are we preparing students to actually enter college, and are we preparing them in college to enter the workforce of the future? I think those are all things that we should think about. And you can't disconnect this conversation from the conversation around vocational technical career skills in this country. We have to take a very strong look at our total education system to make sure we're preparing people for good jobs, jobs that they can support their families living on.
You know, the single best thing we can do for students, and they're burdened with a $1.3 trillion student loan debt, it could be a student loan debt bubble if we don't watch it, is get economic growth moving up even faster so that they can service the debt with a job when they get out of school. But what we don't want to do is keep doing the same thing that doesn't work time and time and time again. And that is subsidizing very expensive four-year liberal arts degrees to the detriment of CTE. Our bill called the Prosper Act, which did not pass, unlike the Perkins CTE bill, which was passed, has in it a mechanism so that Pell Grants can be applied to short-term technical training for the first time. That's what Angie was referencing. That is crucial so we have options for young people so they can get jobs to service the debt they take on, and the debt loads are going to be much, much smaller. So I would say that combined with our college completion success rate, having institutions have skin in the game, but what we can't do is simply say to some people who've taken out debt, we're going to forgive the debt, which my opponent wants to do. But we can't say, if you go into government work, we will forgive the debt, which is the current law, which we're trying to change. And if we say, let's just have free college, the cost, the financial cost will be staggering, but more importantly, we will have a misallocation of resources when kids go to college and say, I think I'll try this for a semester, didn't work. I think I'll try this for a semester, didn't work. I think I'll drop out. Then who picks up the bill? You have to make certain everybody that goes to higher education understands the transparency. People buy a car, a used car, and they see the magic of compound interest. They see the car price, they see the interest rate, then they see the final payment they will make. In the Prosper Act, that's exactly what we did for higher education. If you're going to go to a four-year liberal arts school, here's the tuition, here's what you're borrowing, here's what you're finally going to pay, and here's the likelihood of your wage when you get out. That sort of transparency is desperately needed. It's in almost every other mechanism in life. It ought to be in higher education.
All right, healthcare. In recent surveys, healthcare has become one of, if not the number one, but a very top priority in CD2. So we have some questions around healthcare. Over the last couple years, there has been talk of a buy-in for Medicare at the federal level, or Medicare for all, and for Minnesota Care at the state level. These proposals appear to carve out an even larger piece of the health care from the private market in favor of administration by the public sector. What is your position either of these buy-ins and why? And we will start with the congressman.
Everybody in this room knows that we need health care reform. There's nobody here that thinks health care is better since 2010. Premiums on MNsure have tripled or quadrupled. I was on MNsure. There are families out there that have to pay $25,000 before $1 of insurance kicks in. You got 100,000 people that lost their health insurance from Blue Cross when they just dropped a plan. One insurer for half the country, 349,000 Minnesotans without insurance. Now, you can have the government come in and say, oh, we're going to have all these wonderful benefits are going to be here and here and here. But if you can't afford insurance, what good does it do you? So the question becomes, what's your vision for health care? Which way are you going to go? Are you going to go back to what my parents used to have called major medical, which says we don't want a catastrophic event to bankrupt somebody, cancer, heart disease, hit by a car? Or are we going to go to prepaid, single-payer, government-run system, which historically has told us it doesn't work and costs about $32 trillion, which would bankrupt the country? Medicare right now is on track to be insolvent in 8 years. 8 years. If we do a Medicare buy-in, if we go for the full Monty, Medicare for all, which even Bernie Sanders admits he doesn't know where the revenue is going to come from, the doubling the payroll and income taxes raises about $17 trillion. The plan costs $32 trillion. If we do that, Medicare as we know it for seniors will end. It will be insolvent immediately, and they will be queued up with the rest of the population. I think that is wholly irresponsible. We need to go back to a market-based reform where people can buy the kind of health care they want, to lower the premiums, to let the young and the healthy get back into the insurance pools to subsidize the infirm, and then get back to an invisible risk pool like we had in Minnesota before the Affordable Care Act, the Minnesota Comprehensive Health Association, which worked much better to insure the tough to insure. That is my vision. That's what we're trying to do. Thankfully, we see premiums flatten out this cycle, but only because we passed a 1332 Obamacare waiver to get out from under the Affordable Care Act in Minnesota. We all know we need reform. The question is which vision is you're going to adopt.
Jason, Angie, Craig.
Well, I grew up for part of my childhood without access to health insurance, and I worked in healthcare for over 20 years. I think we need to fix and stabilize the market that we have today. I think we need to introduce more competition into the marketplace by offering similar to a United Healthcare or a Blue Cross plan that's available from Medicare, not subsidized for people to choose to buy into. And I think we need to finally get after the cost of healthcare in this country. And if you really wanted to control the cost of Medicare, Congress would get out of the way and allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices with prescription drug companies. Look, at the end of the day, there are some things we can do on a bipartisan basis to stabilize healthcare. What the congressman just referred to, a reinsurance program for Minnesota, is exactly what I'm proposing at the federal level, reauthorize a reinsurance program. I'm talking about allowing folks to buy into Medicare. I'm talking about turning finally to prescription drug prices in this country and taking on prescription drug companies. And look, at the end of the day, my opponent voted for the American Health Care Act. That gutted pre-existing condition protections in this country. And he is now proposing we go back to the high-risk pool in Minnesota. The only reason the high-risk pool existed in the first place was because insurance companies didn't cover people with pre-existing conditions. If we're covering folks, why would we need those pools? So at the end of the day, he voted for that bill, which put an age tax on 50 to 64-year-olds. It kicked millions of people off their health insurance, and it gutted pre-existing condition protections in this country. I believe there's a lot we can fix about health care, but at the end of the day, we can't go back.
All right, on to the next question. Prescription drugs continue to explode in costs, which is specifically worrisome for senior citizens with fixed incomes. What will you do at the federal level to help ensure the affordability of prescription drugs? And we will start with Angie.
Well, look, this is a significant issue. We cannot go back to a time where our seniors lived in poverty. And being able to afford your prescription drugs, seniors shouldn't have to choose between that or whether they're going to buy groceries, especially if they're living on a fixed income like Social Security. At the end of the day, we should take on big prescription drug companies as the first foremost thing. The only thing standing in the way from Medicare negotiating with prescription drug companies is this Congress. And I personally would start with that. I also believe that we should stop a practice called pay for delay. That allows brand name drug companies to pay off generic manufacturers to stay out of the marketplace. 10% of the drugs, prescription drugs sold in this country cost 70% of the dollars spent. I ran St. Jude Medical's health plan. I had responsibility for 18,000 covered lives in the United States, and I also had responsibility for our plans outside the United States. And at the end of the day, what I can tell you is that Americans are paying too much for their prescription drugs. So we start with ending pay for delay. We negotiate Medicare pricing. We also should consider allowing reimportation of prescription drugs from Canada to introduce more competition into the United States market for those drugs that have been FDA approved in exactly the same formularies. But again, the only reason we aren't doing any of this is because our campaign finance system is broken. And members of Congress will not step up and take on the big pharma companies. And as a member of Congress, I can assure you that my first priority is representing you, not any of the companies in this country.
Prescription drug prices do need to come down. They represent about 17% of all healthcare costs. Unfortunately, we undid the Medicare gag rule where pharmacists couldn't tell people, here's a cheaper alternative. That's gone. The right to know pricing mechanism is now being put forth. We've got that. And certainly we do need to take a look at patents so that generic companies get samples and somebody doesn't have a monopoly for life. All of those are huge problems we are addressing. I would also argue, however, that the part of the problem, a big part of the problem, is that we have to pay for all of the research and development here in the United States. 70% of a branded drug cost is recouped in the United States. Why? Because other countries put price controls or they rip off our patents. So the companies don't make any money abroad. They have to charge you more to make it. Now, that's a trade negotiation we ought to be talking about right now, and the sooner the better. We tried drug reimportation from Canada and Minnesota here, Angie, about a decade ago, and it didn't work. Because it didn't work because the companies brought in drugs, and then you had fewer profits, and they had to raise them here, just as I mentioned. Now, when you talk about the Minnesota Comprehensive Health Insurance invisible pool to cover people, that was paid by insurance companies. They had to pay a fee to that along with the taxpayer, and it worked much better than the Affordable Care Act. And finally, I don't believe that Medicare should increase its price controls. It already pays below market rates, which is why the CEO of the Mayo Clinic not long ago said, if we get somebody coming to the Mayo Clinic and they've got a private network or they got Medicaid or Medicare, we'll take the private network first. Why did he say that? Kind of a Freudian slip? Because those networks pay 40% below market rates. If you have price controls, you're going to get less innovation, you're going to get fewer life-saving drugs, and that's probably why you never advocated price controls for your industry, the medical devices industry, which is actually going up as faster than drug prices. Finally, on campaign finance reform, please. You're taking money from the House Majority PAC, You're taking money from Michael Bloomberg, Environmental Defense Fund, and you were the single largest recipient of one industry in campaign donations, your former industry. So you know, we got to make certain we have
Thank you, Jason.
we have the facts right here.
Thank you, Jason. All right, we'll start with the congressman. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, Minnesota had a health care system in place that, one, helped ensure affordable care coverage for low-income residents, Minnesota Care, and two, helped ensure affordable coverage for residents with pre-existing conditions through the Minnesota's high-risk pool, the Minnesota Comprehensive Health Association, the nation's oldest and largest high-risk pool, both of which the states did with a high quality of care. What is your position on either a full or partial repeal of the ACA, and what would you replace it with?
I absolutely think the ACA has failed. If you remember, the Affordable Care Act said you could keep your plan if you like it, your premiums will go down, and you'll have more choice. Half the country has one insurer, premiums have tripled, and guess what? Everybody's losing their plan right here in Minnesota. On pre-existing conditions, in the law I supported, the American Health Care Act, in the law itself, it says this act shall not be construed to deny anyone with pre-existing condition. And in fact, our act had more protection than Kennedy-Kassenbaum, the HIPAA law in 1996. Under HIPAA, if you went from one employer to another, you had to keep your insurance current or the next company could deny you care. We said, no, can't do that. You keep current with your insurance, nobody can deny you care, and they can't charge you more. It had more protection than Ted Kennedy's bill, and nobody's talking about Ted Kennedy lacking compassion. Here is the fundamental equation. How are you going to get the insurance pools functioning again? We saw the death spiral when the Affordable Care Act was passed, and you had all of these mandates, and the premiums went up, and young people said, I'm not paying $1,200 a month for insurance. I will wait till I get sick, and I'll just pay the penalty for $260 a year. So what happened? Who was left in the insurance pools? The infirm and the sick. That's the insurance pool death spiral that caused premiums to skyrocket. Their plan was, well, here's what we'll do. We'll mandate that everybody has to buy insurance. And that was their plan. The mandate wouldn't have worked unless the penalty was the price of the insurance. So it didn't work, and we saw this disaster. Our plan was to say, let's let prices float. Let's reward people if they're young and healthy and doing the right thing so that young people can buy at a cheaper premium, come back voluntarily into the insurance pools to subsidize the risk for people that need the claims. That, coupled with the invisible risk pool, which we threw $8 billion in funding for, would be a much better way to cover the tough to insure at a much better cost. And indeed, it worked just fine before the Affordable Care Act effectively eliminated that program.
Thank you, Jason. Angie?
So there are definite changes that need to be made to our health insurance program in this country. The ACA has now been the law of the land for almost a decade. So to keep referring to something that is the law of the land, look, there are changes we need to make to improve it. Any big program that's ever been implemented in this country, over time, you've had to implement changes in order to improve. As I've said, there are fixes like a reinsurance program at the federal level. There are changes such as longer-term outlook to cost reduction subsidies. But at the end of the day, those are all about health insurance. And I can tell you that even in employer-based businesses today, the cost of healthcare itself is something that we have finally got to tackle. It's not just about health insurance. It's prescription drug cost, the cost of compound drugs, of specialty drugs. It's the cost of care. Mayo, for example, has an outcomes-based way of looking and completing care in this country. We need to move closer to that model for the whole country. Today, even Medicare is a volume-based business. The more care doctors and hospitals provide, the higher the reimbursement. We need to move toward an outcomes-based care model. And at the end of the day, coming back to the risk pools, there was a study that came out last year that actually said in the individual marketplace, if you look at the high-risk pools, those individuals who formerly were in it were paying about $1,000 less than they would have if Minnesota had continued to run the high-risk pools. And I come back to this point of it's just not true that you didn't gut pre-existing conditions as part of the American Health Care Act, because the MacArthur Amendment allowed states to grant waivers and charge people more.
Thank you, Angie. We'll now move on to a question focusing around Metropolitan Council reform. That has been a very highly discussed subject in our state of Minnesota as well as in CD2. We will start with Angie on this question. The Met Council is the only MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, in the country that has no elected officials on it. They have one of the largest budgets, broadest scope with the taxing authority. Do you think it is better to have elected officials who are accountable to the people instead of one person, the governor? Do you think Minnesota should reduce their jurisdiction or oversight?
Well, I'm going to be a good partner no matter what Minnesota decides to do, and that's the whole point. Is this, to me, is not a federal issue. If the Metropolitan Council, if the state legislature wants to change the way the Met Council works, that's fine by me. Staggered terms is one idea that I think is actually up from a Republican. I would support that. Things like elected officials being on that body, that's absolutely fine by me. At the end of the day, though, when the congressman introduced an amendment, I had mayors calling me left and right saying you are putting federal dollars in jeopardy for transportation funding in the region. Things like the Orange Line out of Burnsville or the Red Line out of Apple Valley, and these are bringing your students right here to Dakota County Technical College. So at the end of the day, I think it's up to Minnesota to decide how they want the Regional Planning Authority to work, and if it's working for them, who am I in Washington to tell Minnesota how to run its Regional Planning Authority? What I am going to be is a huge advocate for transportation funding in this country. Our roads and bridges a few weeks ago were rated a D+. My experience in the private sector is that private sector growth often follows public sector investment. And one of the best examples in this district is along 35 at Elko New Market. There are over 200 acres of land. If Elko had a new interchange right there that would be unlocked for industrial development. I'm going to work with mayors, in towns and townships around this congressional district, and I'm going to be a fierce fighter for transportation infrastructure funding for the 2nd Congressional District of Minnesota.
Well, what you heard is more of the status quo. One of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, D.C. is the Metropolitan Council. They come into every congressional office and they lobby like crazy. Look, here's the bottom line, folks. We are stuck in traffic. We are not investing in roads and bridges where we should because the Met Council has no accountability. Most importantly, the Met Council is a federal program. It's called a Metropolitan Planning Organization. They were started in 1962. To become federally compliant, to get those funds to flow, you have to do this and this and this to stay federally compliant. It is a federal program. So the federal government says to be compliant, you got to have an elected board member. That has been the law from the Met Council since 1991. So why is it the Met Council in Minnesota doesn't have one? Because they were grandfathered in, and there's been this ping pong back and forth of whether they've been in compliance. So I simply said, let's offer an amendment to say to be just like every other MPO in the country. Listen to that. Every other MPO in the country has an elected board member except us. We have the largest MPO in the country. We don't have an elected board member. We are the only MPO in the country that can independently raise taxes. We don't have a board member. But we want the federal funding. We just don't want the accountability. So the amendment passed unanimously in the House. Nobody objected. Why? Because everybody else is already in compliance. It was at the last moment withdrawn from the Senate because of the Democrat senators over there in that body got it out. But in the final analysis, we need reform for transportation infrastructure from the Met Council so people can go there. And I'm glad to say that the FTA just sent us a letter a month ago saying they are reviewing whether our Metropolitan Council is in compliance with the federal requirements to get federal funds. Finally, this. In 1991, when these other MPOs had to come in compliance with these rules, they didn't lose federal funding. The FTA says, you got 2 years to come in compliance. happened smooth, just like clockwork. Not $1 of federal funding was lost. So look, if you want the status quo, you got your candidate. If you want change and finding the Met Council to be accountable, help us out.
Thank you, Congressman. Just to remind the candidates, Josie's doing a wonderful job being a timekeeper, and if you could just acknowledge her when she holds up the halfway point, that'd be great. Hang in there, Josie, you're doing great.
Welcome to politics.
Yeah. And it's very important because we have lots of questions that I would want to get through, so thank you very much. We're going to move on next to the economy, and we're going to start with the congressman. Congressman, did you vote for or against the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? And if so, could you explain your position?
Not only did I vote for it, I was an eager booster and was fortunate enough to be incorporated by leadership to engage in the debate on the floor, and I'm proud of that because I ran on that in 2016. If you were a small businessman or businesswoman in 2016, your top marginal rate as a non-C Corp pass-through was approaching 60%. 39.6% at the federal level. We take out the itemized deductions, PEP and Ps, you go up to 43, 44%. Mark Dayton wants his 10%. Self-employment tax, 15.3%. Pretty soon you're at 62, 63% on the next marginal dollar earned. Who invests in an economy like that? Nobody. They don't take the risk. So in order to bring that risk back into the market, to bring capital and labor together, I always like to say the truck driver is a heck of a lot more productive with the truck. So we've got to encourage capital to come back into the market with labor so everybody gains. We lowered the rates on capital. We lowered the rates on labor. And what did we get? Same thing we've seen throughout history. In the 1920s when Andrew Mellon did it. In the 1960s when JFK did it. In the 1980s when Reagan did it. Even Bill Clinton cut the capital gains tax cut. The Democrat running over in the third, Dean Phillips, even said we got to have corporate relief because this was killing us on the C Corp side. Trillions of dollars parked offshore because if they brought their money, their foreign profits back to the United States before the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we were the only country to tax it twice. Somebody earned money in Ireland and they brought it back to Germany, they went right to work. But if they did it in America and they paid the 12.5% Irish tax, there was a tax strategy out there called the double Irish. I always thought that was a drink, but it was actually a tax strategy. They brought the money back to America. They said, oh, you paid your 12.5% foreign profit, but you owe us 23.5% more because our top rate was 35%. So you had trillions of dollars offshore. That's been repatriated back. Look, you can't argue with success. We've got the greatest economy since 1969, according to the unemployment statistics. We've got median income going up, after-tax income 6%, wages going up, bonuses going up, utility bills coming down. This has been an astounding success, and I'm a little perplexed as to why my opponent called it the worst piece of legislation in history and wants to repeal the whole thing, not just the corporate side.
Thank you, Jason. Angie.
Well, look, we're in the 9th year of recovery from an economic recession. Absolutely. 64% of Americans polled a few weeks ago said they have not felt like there's been any more money in their paycheck because of the tax bill as a result of that. Look, I support middle-class tax reform and tax reform for small businesses. But the last time we tried trickle-down economics in this country was in the 1980s, and I lived in a mobile home court with my mom, and I can promise you that nothing trickled down to us. We gave 80% of the tax cut benefit to large corporations and to the top 5% of income earners in this country. That is about priorities. And your priority in this Congress by congressional Republicans were big corporations and very rich people. At the end of the day, I think we need to do what we should have done in the first place, and that's give the middle class a larger tax cut and focus on small businesses. We also added $2 trillion to the federal deficit, almost $2 trillion to the federal debt. We did that by giving $1 trillion away to large corporations. And now Republicans like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and Jason Lewis are talking about entitlement reform. What entitlement reform is, they're coming after your Medicare and Social Security, and they're going to cut it or raise the retirement age in order to pay for their tax cut for very large companies. At the end of the day, the congressman is well aware that I supported repatriation of corporate taxes to reinvest, But I tell you, we should have done that and gotten something for it. If we were going to allow big companies to have tax reform, we should have made them invest in infrastructure in this country and in our district.
Thank you, Angie. All right, we will start this next question with Angie Craig. Small businesses and farmers are the backbone of our economy. How can you, as a House of Representatives, best help them?
That's a great question, and you're exactly right. I just finished up a small business tour around the 2nd Congressional District, and since leaving St. Jude, I've invested in a small business in St. Paul myself, so I agree with that 100%. One of the businesses that I was fortunate enough to tour was Lark Toys in Kellogg. Just an amazing business that was started. And as I talked to Kathy and as I talked to Miranda, what they told me is some of the biggest challenges that their family faced as they were starting that business is access to capital. And I believe that some of the rollback of regulation and belief that, you know, in this country there's a big banks and there's small community banks, I think some of that is progress in the last couple of years. So I believe we should be giving tax breaks to small businesses, things like being able to deduct the cost of health care for yourself and your employees, especially for businesses that aren't required to provide health care for their full-time employees, but they actually choose to do that. I also think we should finally tackle the high cost of health care in this country, that is a major emphasis to help small businesses. And I want to talk about farmers for a minute, because I have spent a lot of time on a lot of farms this election cycle. And health care, too, is one of the biggest challenges that our nation's farmers face. Often one partner has to work off farm in order to bring in the health care. And so finally tackling not just the high cost of health insurance, but the high cost of health care in this country is a major challenge. The other thing we've got to do, though, is we've got to make sure that we are opening up markets for our nation's farmers. They need a fair price and they need access to markets. And if you look at the Farm Bill, the House Farm Bill that congressional Republicans passed, they actually eliminated any provision for marketing, for trade outside the United States. And we have to do better for the nation's farmers.
Thank you, Angie.
Yeah, I was glad to vote for the Farm Bill and moving forward on that. It's stuck in the Senate, as most things are many times. But it was a good bill, and it did hold or gave the farmers the safety net they needed and helped to open up markets. And now we've got, for the first time, our dairy farmers have access to the Canadian markets, which, by the way, is why there were so many protests in Canada the other day, because after the new agreement, we finally can sell our dairy products to Canada. All of that is good. The other thing we need to do for farmers is make certain that the estate tax doesn't prevent them from handing their farm to their kids. We doubled that exemption for family farms. Now, Angie would probably call that another giveaway to the rich. I don't think a family farmer who happens to be land rich but cash poor ought to have to sell the farm in order to hand it off. And that's the sort of class warfare we don't need if we're trying to grow the economy. When it comes to all of these issues on small business, it is, Angie says, well, let's make certain we allow small business and farmers to deduct the cost of health care. That's what we did in the American Health Care Act. We equalized the tax code so that people could deduct as individuals and pass through businesses their health care costs, just like big corporations where Angie worked could. Now, if you're talking about 80% of the tax cut, which also went to farmers, $3,154 was the average tax cut for a family of four in the 2nd District. 90% of filers got a tax cut. And this went to, the largest percentage cuts were in the bottom rung brackets, not the top rung brackets. The 80% figure that Angie keeps citing is based on a false premise, and that is the individual tax cuts expire. Once they're put there permanently, which we've already voted in the House to do, that 80% figure is gone, If she thinks raising taxes can solve the debt, we need to look at the last administration. They raised taxes, the largest tax hike in history, and the debt doubled under President Obama. And if you want to talk about Medicare insolvency, Angie, having Medicare for all, what you initially said you wanted to work toward, now you're back to a Medicare buy-in or something, that will make it insolvent in a New York minute.
Thank you, Jason. All right, I want to ask a yes or no question. All right? Let's see how we do with this one, all right? And we'll start with the congressman. Yes or no? Do you support a $15 federal minimum wage?
No.
Angie?
That's not fair.
Who said life was meant to be fair?
I will add yes or no at the end. If you index the minimum wage from $7.25 to today, it's around $12.80. I support working toward a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. Yes.
Thank you. Almost there on the yes or no. So, all right. On to climate change. There is a mountain of evidence that says climate change is real and humans are causing it. What policies do you support to lower greenhouse gas emissions and create jobs? And we will start with the congressman.
You know, it's actually good news on that front. For the first time, our emissions are at 1985 levels. That come from the Clean Power Plan, which was a $33 billion carbon tax? No. Did it come from the Paris Accord, which is $2 trillion in global tax? No. It came from the fracking revolution, that we're now using more natural gas than coal, and our emissions have dropped, while emissions in India, in China, are going through the roof. Part of the problem with the international accords to address this is it penalizes us and gives them loopholes, and that's a massive transfer of wealth that I'm not willing to do. So let's let technology and market forces handle this the way it handles most things, and I'm very confident it will. But I will tell you, the day the IPCC report came out not long ago that said, oh goodness, we've got to stop the 2% degree or 2-degree rise to 2100 or else, a Nobel Prize in climate economics was awarded to William Nordhaus of Yale, who said the cost of doing that would be 3 times the cost of doing nothing. It would bankrupt the globe. And he's a climate economist who thinks global warming is real. In the final analysis, I'm not going to put Pine Bend, our refinery in the 2nd District, at risk by supporting bad regulation. I'm not going to put Yucca Mountain at risk and the nuclear power plant in Red Wing at risk because of these regulations. Those are jobs in the 2nd District that I support, and why probably I got the endorsement of the local operating engineer 49ers and the Carpenters Union.
Angie?
Well, the first thing I would say is I believe climate change is real, because I believe the scientists who tell me that. And I also believe that humans are contributing, and our carbon emissions are contributing to global warming. And so I think it's just, first of all, let's acknowledge it. At the end of the day, climate change is presenting serious national security risks, economic risks. You think about the additional flooding we are having with our crop farmers. You think about Hurricane Michael, which has just devastated the East Coast, and the economic impact of those natural disasters. We're either going to pay for it now or we're going to pay for it later. And inaction is not an option, in my opinion. We have a huge opportunity in the same breath to create economic growth by a focus on renewable energy, on solar, on wind, good jobs that can only be done right here in Minnesota. And I think we need to recognize that the growth industry, 17% growth in renewable energy in 2017, is coming from non-coal-based, non-oil-based industries. So while I support energy independence and an all-of-the-above energy strategy, I certainly promote a move to this country toward renewable energy. There are a number of really interesting ideas out there. I think it's really good that the administration just said we were going to move to E15 year-round, so that's a productive start. But I also think we need to rejoin the world community with the Paris Accord, and we need to participate in trying to make sure that we're doing everything possible to stop climate change.
Thank you, Angie. All right, immigration. What immigration reform would you like to see implemented into law that would help address the workforce shortage while protecting good-paying American jobs? And we'll start with Angie.
Now, this is a great issue, an important economic issue to talk about. So I support comprehensive immigration reform. that provides a path to citizenship for law-abiding immigrants like our dreamers, and at the same time will create very strong economic growth for the United States of America. Don't just believe me. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce former CEO said that this is absolutely critical to the economic growth of Minnesota. So think about this for a minute. 40% of Fortune 500 companies here in Minnesota were started by either immigrants or children of immigrants. 6% of Minnesota businesses are immigrant-owned and employ over 60,000 people. We have a work shortage here in Minnesota, 143,000 open positions and 0.6 applicants for each of those. Over $500 billion in economic growth as a result of moving forward with comprehensive immigration reform. And truly think back, it was only 5 years ago that the Senate passed bipartisan immigration reform. 68 senators, based on the economic opportunities of immigration reform, as well as security, border security. So I absolutely support comprehensive immigration reform, and frankly, look at that Senate bill. There was money in there for additional border security, for additional border agents, for 600 miles of fencing. I think we have got to take a comprehensive look at immigration. This is really, truly about economic growth, and we can do both, protect our borders and grow our economy.
Well, I'm glad you support the immigration reform because I voted for it twice. Good Lot 1 and Good Lot 2. Had a fix for the Dreamers. In fact, Good Lot 2 even gave them a green card path. Had a fix for family separation by undoing the Flores consent decree going back to the Clinton era. It had a fix for seasonal workers and non-seasonal workers with more work visas. It was all in Good Lot 1 and Good Lot 2 in the House bills that I voted for. It was the condition. And there's a lot of talk about compromise in Washington, and we hear it from the other side all the time. You're not willing to compromise. We said, well, there's some on our caucus that really doesn't want a path to the green card for the Dreamers. They think it'll encourage more people to come across. Some people are concerned about who's coming up from south of the border, whether they're criminals and coming up with kids that aren't even related to them. But we will compromise with you if you'll compromise with us. So we don't have a DACA crisis in 2 years or 4 years or 5 years. So we don't have another family separation in 2 years or 4 years or 5 years. Let's secure the border, and part of that's got to be a wall. The other side said, nope, we're not doing that. You just give us what we want, no wall. I went to the border this summer. I toured with a Customs Border Patrol agent. She was showing me a place in San Diego called Smuggler's Gulch, where in the 1980s, before any wall in San Diego, 620,000 illegals came across, and they did nothing because they couldn't. Today, they've got 2 walls in San Diego in just 14 miles, and the city of San Ysidro is a safe, family-oriented place because of border security. If you want to fix all the other issues, including the work shortage, you've got to secure that border, and I'm committed to doing that. And by the way, I'd say this. We do need the workers. We have got plenty of jobs, but we don't have enough workers. But it's not do us any good if we don't get the Enbridge pipeline built, because Pine Bend, the refinery, 4,000 people in our district says they need it, and Angie opposes it because she's more interested in the Paris Climate Accord. It's not going to do us any good if we don't get a permanent storage for Yucca Mountain, at Yucca Mountain, for the interim waste at Red Wing, but Angie opposes it because the Sierra Club opposes it. Those jobs are the ones that need to be filled.
Thank you, Jason. All right, we're getting down to the wire here. I have one more question. I'm going to switch it up. 1 minute response. Okay, 1 minute.
Is this another yes or no?
No. And this will be an interesting because you have 1 minute. What is your position on NAFTA? Support renegotiation or support withdrawing from the agreement? And we'll start with you, Congressman.
I support what the administration did, the United States, the Mexican-Canada agreement. I think it's a good piece of work. I think it makes certain that we're making more things in America without destroying the trading relationship. It certainly is a big boon to our dairy farmers in the 2nd District down in Goodhue and Wabasha, who for the first time have access to that. And it puts pressure on China, which is the real tough nut to crack in all of this, especially since they're stealing our intellectual property. So I think the administration actually saying, look, we are going to be the first administration to do something, not just talk about fair trade. We all want free trade, but we've got to get fair trade, and we're getting there.
Time to spare. Angie Craig.
Well, I'm going to correct the record just a moment ago on the Enbridge pipeline in my position. I do not oppose it as long as it meets all of the very stringent Minnesota environmental regulations, and I certainly support moving nuclear storage from Red Wing, so to be clear. All right, so I support NAFTA. It needed to be updated. There were some critical updates as part of the renegotiation of NAFTA. I support both strong labor agreements as well as environmental concerns. And at the end of the day, we have to have fair trade agreements with strong environmental standards. Those are the two most important things that we have to do. China is an offender. I worked in a global business. Over 50% of our revenue came from outside the United States. We're only 5% of the world's population. Our businesses and farmers need strong markets.
Thank you, Angie. All right, we are now going to move to closing comments, and we will start with Angie Craig.
Well, thank you so much. Over the past several weeks, I've been on a small business tour of this congressional district, and what's been so fun about that is I've met so many people who took a chance and they started their business, and it just takes incredible courage to do that. As a member of Congress, I promise to show up, to hold public forums just like the one we're having today, with robust question and answer periods. I promise to be visible and available. We have to work together, and we have to start governing again in this country. We have to start looking for common ground, or we will never find it. I'm a mom, a healthcare leader, and a wife. I live in Eagan. I go to church in Apple Valley. My son goes to high school in Rosemont. This is my community. I'll never forget where I came from or who I represent and work for. And I humbly ask for your vote on November 6th. Thank you.
Congressman.
You know, elections do decide where we want to go in the 2nd District, as a state, as a country. And I can't think of too many midterms in my lifetime that have been more clear on the direction one way or another. The question is, if you look at what we've done in the 115th, getting the economy jump-started, the greatest regulatory overhaul in a generation, career and technical education, the largest bill, Met Council reform that I'm working on, Dodd-Frank reform, finally. Maxine Waters, as chair of the Financial Services Committee, has already said she's going to reinstate Dodd-Frank. That's going to devastate community banks and credit unions. Jerome Nadler, as chair of the Judiciary Committee, if the Democrats take over, said, I'm going to reopen the Kavanaugh investigation, and we will impeach a sitting Supreme Court justice attacking the independence of the judiciary. We've got Adam Schiff at Intel and Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. You will have a constitutional crisis, and you will have chaos if the Democrats take the House. Don't take my word for it. That's what they're saying. So the question becomes, where do you want to go? Do you want more growth, more economic prosperity, more freedom? Or do you want to go the road of chaos and democratic socialism? And they're saying that. So the question becomes, in this election, we either keep the economic growth going, or we go backwards, and a long ways backwards.
All right, well, thank you, Angie and Jason, very much, and for a very lively, spirited discussion, I might add. A few, Angie and Jason, just a few closing comments, if you will. On behalf of the Dakota County Regional Chamber of Commerce, we'd like to thank each of the candidates for taking time to share a bit more about yourselves and the views on such important issues affecting CD2. I want to acknowledge President Burnett and DCTC and Inver Hills Community College, the maintenance staff, the facilities staff from the college. Thank you so much. This was a group effort to put this forum on, and I want you to know that everybody came together to make this possible. I'd like to thank Access Eagan. Yes. Access Eagan in Town Square, thank you so much for being here to stream the event live. We will have this available for rebroadcast, so you can check the Chamber website. The Dakota County Sheriff's Department, thank you so much, officers. And And especially, thank you for your public service in keeping our community in Dakota County safe. We really appreciate that. And a big shout out to our students at the student government for DCTC in Ember Hills. And finally, thank you to our sponsors, Velocity Public Affairs. Thank you so much. Thank you to my partners, Ed Kearney at Apple Valley Chamber of Commerce, Jennifer Herning at Burnsville Chamber of Commerce. We appreciate your support. I think I'm almost there. And again, finally, please remember to vote on November 6th. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Marie. Great job.
We're going to try to do a quick